Beneath the Surface. Chapter 1. The first cracket started with a whisper, a lingering scent on her clothes that wasn't mine, a subtle shift in her gaze when I asked about her day, the way she locked her phone at night when she used to leave it. Face up on the nightstand. I should have let it go. I should have believed her when she said she was just stressed. But I knew better. Betrayal isn't loud. It doesn't arrive in grand gestures or obvious tells. It seeps in slowly, dripping into the cracks until the foundation rots from the inside. So I began to watch. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. The first step was the phone. She used to text in front of me, laugh at memes, complain about coworkers. Now she turned away when a message came in. I caught the reflection of her screen in the bathroom mirror one night, just enough to see a name I didn't recognize. Daniel K., not just Daniel. The last initial was deliberate, formal, cautious. Waited until she was asleep, then slipped out of bed and took her phone from the dresser. Face ID wouldn't work with her asleep, but I remembered something, a trick I'd read somewhere. Holding the phone just close enough to her face, angling it ever so slightly. Click. Unlocked. My pulse pounded as I scrolled. At first, nothing. A few unread work emails, a group chat with friends. Then buried under a generic contact name, work meetup, were the texts. Daniel K. wasn't some coworker. He wasn't a distant friend. He was something more. I miss you. Tonight felt too short. Next time, longer. He doesn't suspect, does he? My hands clenched around the phone. She stirred in bed and I locked the screen, placing it back exactly where I found it. But the damage was done. The truth was no longer a shadowy suspicion. It was real. And I needed proof. Chapter 3. Following the trail the next morning, she kissed me goodbye like nothing was wrong. I played along. I smiled. I asked her what time she'd be home. She lied straight to my face. I took the day off work and followed her. She drove downtown, not to her office, but to a cafe on the west side. A man was already waiting for her. Daniel K. He wasn't particularly handsome, not in a way that would make him stand out. But he had something, a confidence in the way he leaned in close, the way she smiled at him. A smile I hadn't seen in months. I took photos from my car. Every stolen glance, every touch of her hand on his arm, every second that cemented the truth. Then, something unexpected. As she left, Daniel didn't follow. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made a call. I couldn't hear what he said, but his face hardened. Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction. I wasn't just dealing with an affair. I was dealing with something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface, and I wasn't about to stop now. Do you want me to continue this as a slow-burn psychological thriller or escalate it with high-stakes confrontation? Let me know how dark or intense you'd like the investigation to get. Beneath the Surface, Chapter 1. The first cracket started with a whisper, a lingering scent on her clothes that wasn't mine. A subtle shift in her gaze when I asked about her day, the way she locked her phone at night when she used to leave it, face up on the nightstand. I should have let it go. I should have believed her when she said she was just stressed, but I knew better. Betrayal isn't loud. It doesn't arrive in grand gestures or obvious tells. It seeps in slowly, dripping into the cracks until the foundation rots from the inside. So I began to watch. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. The first step was the phone. She used to text in front of me, laugh at memes, complain about coworkers. Now, she turned away when a message came in. I caught the reflection of her screen in the bathroom mirror one night, just enough to see a name I didn't recognize. Daniel K. Not just Daniel. The last initial was deliberate, formal, cautious. waited until she was asleep, then slipped out of bed and took her phone from the dresser. Face ID wouldn't work with her asleep, but I remembered something, a trick I'd read somewhere. Holding the phone just close enough to her face, angling it ever so slightly. Click. Unlocked. My pulse pounded as I scrolled. At first, nothing. A few unread work emails, a group chat with friends. Then, buried under a generic contact name, Work Meetup, were the texts. Daniel K. wasn't some coworker. He wasn't a distant friend. He was something more. I miss you. Tonight felt too short. Next time longer. He doesn't suspect, does he? My hands clenched around the phone. She stirred in bed, and I locked the screen, placing it back exactly where I found it. But the damage was done. The truth was no longer a shadowy suspicion. It was real, and I needed proof. Chapter 3. Following the Trail. The next morning, she kissed me goodbye like nothing was wrong. I played along, I smiled. I asked her what time she'd be home. She lied straight to my face. I took the day off work and followed her. She drove downtown, not to her office, but to a cafe on the west side. A man was already waiting for her. Daniel K. He wasn't particularly handsome, not in a way that would make him stand out. But he had something. A confidence in the way he leaned in close, the way she smiled at him. A smile I hadn't seen in months. I took photos from my car. Every stolen glance, every touch of her hand on his arm, every second that cemented the truth. Then, something unexpected. As she left, Daniel didn't follow. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made a call. I couldn't hear what he said, but his face hardened. Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction. I wasn't just dealing with an affair. I was dealing with something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. And I wasn't about to stop now. Do you want me to continue this as a slow-burn psychological thriller or escalate it with high-stakes confrontation? Let me know how dark or intense you'd like the investigation to get. Beneath the Surface, Part 2, Chapter 4. Pieces of the puzzle, I couldn't let it go. The texts, the stolen glances, the way she came home smelling of a different cologne, it was all adding up. But I needed something concrete, something undeniable. Went back to her phone when she was in the shower. This time I took a different approach. I checked her ride history. A week ago, she'd taken an Uber to a hotel. Not a bar, not a restaurant, a hotel. My stomach twisted. The drop-off was at the Westford, a boutique place downtown. Not the kind of spot you book for a business meeting. I copied the details, then placed her phone back before she stepped out, wrapped in a towel, humming like nothing was wrong. I kissed her cheek, tasting betrayal. Chapter 5. The hotel room. I went to the Westford that evening. The receptionist barely glanced at me as I walked in, but I knew I couldn't just ask for records. So I tried something simpler. I waited. The bellhop was young, maybe early 20s, distracted as he scrolled his phone near the front desk. I approached, feigning impatience. "Hey, man," I said, slipping a 20 onto the counter. "I need to check something. My wife was here last week. Surprise anniversary thing. I think she left something in the room." His eyes flickered to the bill, then to me. "What room?" "She came in last Thursday," I said, trying to sound casual. "Around 6, I think?" He hesitated. But the 20 became 40. After a glance over his shoulder, he leaned in. 407, he muttered. My pulse spiked. Chapter 6. The Room. Key. I had two options. Walk away and pretend I didn't know, or push further. I chose the latter. I watched the front desk, waiting for an opening. When the receptionist turned away, I slid into the hallway where the staff room was. A wall of spare key cards sat unattended. I palmed one labeled Emergency Access and walked to the elevator like I belonged there. The fourth floor smelled of fresh linen and polished wood. Room 407 was at the end of the hall. I pressed the card to the lock. The green light blinked. Click, I stepped inside. Chapter 7. The truth in the dark. The room was pristine, but I wasn't looking for something obvious. I checked the trash, empty, the bathroom, clean. But the sheets told a different story. The faintest imprint of a body still lingered in the fabric. The scent of perfume mixed with aftershave I didn't recognize. Then I saw it, a single earring, glinting under the nightstand. I picked it up. Gold. Small. Familiar. I had given it to her on our anniversary last year. My fingers curled around the cold metal as the weight of it all settled in. This was it. No more doubts. No more questions. She had been here. With him. Chapter 8. The final piece. I left the hotel and sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I could confront her, demand the truth. Or I could wait, see how far she was, willing to go. I pulled out my phone and did something I never thought I'd have to do. I hired a private investigator. If she was lying to me, I was going to know everything, and then I would decide what came next. Do you want me to continue with the PI's findings and the confrontation, or take the story in a different direction, perhaps with an unexpected twist? Beneath the surface. Part 3, Chapter 9. The Watcher in the Shadows. I met the private investigator 2 days later at a dimly lit bar downtown. His name was Carter, a grizzled man in his late 50s with eyes that had seen too much. The kind of guy who knew how to dig up secrets people wished would stay buried. "You want the full truth?" he asked, lighting a cigarette despite the no-smoking sign. "Because sometimes the truth ain't what you expect." I slid a photo of Daniel K. across the table. I need to know who he is, what he wants with my wife, and if this is just an affair, or something more. Carter studied the picture before slipping it into his pocket. Give me 3 days. Chapter 10. A Trail of Lies. I spent those 3 days in a fog. My wife, Claire, was perfect at pretending. She still kissed me in the morning, still laughed at my jokes. But now every glance felt calculated, every touch rehearsed. I didn't tell. Her I knew. I needed to see how far she was willing to go. Then on the third night, Carter called. Meet me. Now. Chapter 11. The Other Man. The drive felt endless. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly I thought the leather would tear. When I arrived, Carter was waiting outside a diner, looking even grimmer than usual. He handed me a manila folder. "Daniel K. isn't who you think he is." I opened it. The first few photos were of Claire and Daniel together, laughing, talking, touching, proof of the affair. Then I flipped to the next page, a background check, Daniel Kessler. Age, 41. Occupation, private security. Formerly employed by... I stopped breathing. He had worked for my company. More than that, he had worked for me. "Your wife's not just cheating on you," Carter said, his voice like gravel. "She's been meeting with a man who has a history with you, and I don't think it's a coincidence." Chapter 12. The hidden truth memories crashed over me. Daniel Kessler. 3 years ago, I had been involved in a corporate case, an internal fraud investigation. A security contractor had been caught leaking confidential information to a competitor. I hadn't handled it personally, but I remembered the fallout. Someone had been fired. Someone had lost everything. I just never thought it would come back, to haunt me. "Are you telling me this is personal?" I asked. Carter exhaled smoke. "Looks that way. My wife wasn't just betraying me. She was playing a game I didn't even know I was part of. And now, I had to figure out why. Do you want the confrontation to happen next? Or should I build more tension and uncover deeper secrets before the final reckoning? Beneath the Surface. Part 4, Chapter 13. The final nail. I spent the night staring at the manila folder on my desk. I had the proof. The photos, the background check, the texts from her phone. Everything I needed to confront Claire. But the pieces weren't adding up. This wasn't just an affair. It was deliberate, calculated, and that meant she wasn't just cheating on me. She was hiding something. Chapter 14. Tracking the lies, I needed one last piece of evidence, something undeniable. Next morning, I left for work like usual. But instead of heading to the office, I parked a few blocks away and waited. At 11:15 a.m., Claire's car pulled out of the driveway. She was supposed to be at home today. I followed at a distance, weaving through traffic, my heart pounding with every turn she took. I already knew where she was going, the Westford Hotel, but this time, I wasn't just going to watch. Beneath the Surface. Part 4, Chapter 13. The final proof Carter's revelation sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. My wife wasn't just cheating, she was tangled up with someone connected to my past. But before I confronted her, I needed one final piece of evidence, something undeniable, something she couldn't explain away. So I followed her. Chapter 14. The second hotel room Claire told me she had a late meeting. I pretended to believe her. But I already knew where she was going. Carter had tracked her patterns, where she met Daniel, the places they thought were hidden. That night, she had a reservation at the Lancaster, a high-end hotel on the city's edge. Room 512. I parked across the street and watched as she arrived. She stepped out of an Uber, her coat wrapped tight around her, her hair styled just enough to look effortless. She hesitated for half a second before walking inside. That hesitation told me everything. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She just didn't care. Chapter 15. Inside the room, I waited 10 minutes before moving. Walking into the hotel lobby, I kept my head down and approached the desk. The receptionist barely glanced at me. Room 512, I said, slipping a folded $100 bill onto the counter. I need an extra key. My wife forgot hers. She hesitated. But greed is a powerful motivator. 30 seconds later, I was riding the elevator up, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The hallway was silent. I stood outside the door, breathing hard, gripping the key card like a trigger. Then, I slid it in. Green light. Click. I stepped inside. Chapter 16. Caught in the act, the air smelled of perfume and betrayal. I moved quietly, stepping past the small sitting area, past the untouched minibar. Then I saw them. Claire. Daniel. She was on the bed, her back against the headboard, his body close to hers. They weren't tangled together, not yet, but the intimacy in the air was thick enough to suffocate me. She was laughing, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't given me in months. Something inside me broke. Neither of them noticed me at first. It wasn't until I spoke, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it, that Claire's smile dropped. Having a good time? Her head snapped toward me, her eyes going wide. Daniel moved instinctively, placing himself between us. I stepped forward, every nerve in my body screaming. "Go ahead," I said, voice low. "Explain this." Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because there was nothing left to say. Do you want the confrontation to escalate into something more intense, or do you want a psychological battle between them? Let me know how you want the story to unfold. Beneath the Surface. Part 5, Chapter 17. Silence. before the storm. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the hotel's air conditioning, chilling the room even more than the tension hanging between us. Claire sat frozen, on the bed, her fingers still gripping the sheets like she could somehow anchor herself. Daniel, however, moved, slow, calculated. His body shifted in front of hers, protective, like he thought I'd do something reckless. Maybe I would have. Say something, I finally muttered, my voice barely more than a breath. Claire blinked, her lips parting, but no words came out, and then she did something I hadn't expected. She exhaled, like a weight had been lifted. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. Something hot and sharp burned in my chest. "You don't get to ask me that," I snapped. Her eyes flickered with something, not guilt, not regret. Something else. Resignation. Daniel shifted. "Look, man." "Shut up," I said, cutting him off with a glare that could have split stone. He shut up. I turned back to Claire. "How long?" She looked down at her hands. Then, almost too softly, she said, 6 months. The words were a gunshot to the ribs. I had known for a few weeks, suspected for longer. But 6 months? That meant every kiss, every "I love you," every moment we shared during that time. It had all been a lie. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. "Why?" Claire let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Why do people cheat?" "That's not an answer," I growled. Her gaze finally met mine, and for the first time, I saw something break behind it. A flicker of something real beneath the layers of deception. "You stopped seeing me," she whispered. "Before Daniel, before all of this. I felt invisible. To you." I clenched my jaw. "So your solution was this?" Her lips pressed together. "I don't expect you to understand." I laughed then, dark, humorless. "No, you don't. Because I was right here, Claire. And instead of telling me how you felt, you found someone else to make you feel important." Her eyes darted to Daniel. But he didn't speak. Smart choice. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Tell me the truth. Is it just an affair? Or something more?" Her breath hitched. For the first time, she hesitated. And that was my answer. I exhaled slowly. I hope he was worth it. Her face crumpled slightly, but I didn't care. I turned and walked toward the door. But before I left, I glanced over my shoulder at Daniel. Whatever. She told you about me, whatever story she spun. Just know, she's good at making people believe what they want to hear. Then I walked out. And this time, I wasn't looking back. Chapter 18. The fallout. I didn't go home. Not right away. Instead, I drove aimlessly, my mind a storm of rage, grief, and something else I couldn't name. Betrayal isn't just about infidelity. It's about trust, about choice. And Claire had made hers. By the time I pulled into my driveway, hours later, my phone was buzzing. Claire. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked inside, poured myself a drink, and stared at the wedding photo still hanging on the wall. Then, without a second thought, I took it down and shattered the glass against the floor, because whatever we had, it was already broken. Do you want to explore Claire's reaction, legal fallout, divorce, revenge, etc., or take this story in an unexpected direction, hidden motivations, secrets, or a noir-style twist? Let me know how dark or intense you want it to get. Beneath the Surface, Part 6, Chapter 19. The Ghost of Us. The morning after I caught Claire in that hotel room, I woke up to silence. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but hollow. A vacuum where something used to be. She hadn't come. Home. Good. I stared at my phone, unread messages stacking up like debris from a wreck. Claire, 3:12 a.m. We need to talk. Claire, 4:47 a.m. Please just answer me. Claire, 7:02 a.m. I'm coming home today. We have to figure this out. I tossed the phone aside. Figure this out? Like this was some mutual misunderstanding. Like I had any interest in hearing the excuses I already knew she was rehearsing. I grabbed a coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the empty seat across from me. I could almost hear her voice, the ghost of morning conversations past. Did you sleep okay? What do you have planned today? I love you. All of it meant nothing now. By noon, I heard the sound of a car pulling up. Claire was home. Chapter 20. The lie that became truth. I didn't get up. I let her walk through the front door, let her step into the house like she still belonged there. She smelled like a mix of perfume and hotel soap. She set her bag down slowly, eyes flicking to me. I didn't know if you'd be here, she said softly. I took a sip of coffee. Where else would I be? A pause, a hesitation, like she had expected me to disappear. You didn't answer my calls, she murmured, stepping forward. Why are you here, Claire? I cut her off, finally meeting her gaze. She flinched at the coldness in my voice. Because we need to talk, she said. Because we owe it to each other to... I slammed my mug down. No, Claire, you owe me the truth, and last night, that was all I needed to see. Her lips parted like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she sighed, ran a hand through her hair, and whispered, I never meant to hurt you. I laughed, sharp, bitter. Yeah? Well, you did. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. I didn't just cheat on you, you know. I stared at her. What? Her eyes darkened. I chose him. For a second, I thought I misheard. I thought I was happy, she continued, voice shaking. But when I met Daniel, I realized I wasn't. Not with you. The words were a knife, twisting deeper than I thought possible. Claire took another step closer, searching my face. And I know that's not what you want to hear. But it's the truth. I clenched my fists under the table, jaw tight. So why are you here then? If you've already made your choice? Her breath hitched. Because I don't know if I made the right one. A cruel, empty laugh left my throat. You did? She winced. I'm sorry. No, you're not, I interrupted. You're sorry you got caught. Her eyes shimmered with something. Regret? Guilt? I didn't care anymore. I stood, grabbing my keys. I'm done, Claire. She blinked. Where are you going? I smirked. To see a divorce lawyer. And this time, I was the one who walked away. Chapter 21. The final cut. I didn't give Claire a chance to weasel her way back in. I met with a lawyer that afternoon. Told them I wanted the process started immediately. When I got home, Claire was still there, waiting. You don't have to do this, she said, voice trembling. We can figure something out. I stared at her like she was a stranger, because she was. We already did, I said. And with that, I handed her the divorce papers and walked upstairs, leaving her standing in the wreckage of what she destroyed. She could have Daniel, but she would never have me again. Do you want a twist? Maybe Claire was lying about choosing Daniel, or she has another secret? Or should this be a clean break with a focus on moving forward? Let me know how you want it to end. Beneath the Surface, Part 7, Chapter 22. The unraveling days passed in a blur. The divorce process was a mechanical thing. Forms, signatures, a series of uncomfortable meetings with lawyers and mediators. The lawyers were efficient, pushing me through the steps like I was just another case. But each step felt like I was losing something. Not just Claire, but myself. I wasn't angry anymore. Just numb. And then, a week after I filed, I received a call. It was Claire's lawyer. "We've received a counterclaim," she said. "Your wife has changed her mind about the divorce." I thought it was a mistake. Maybe she was trying to stall or get some leverage. But as I sat in my car, reading through the papers she'd signed, I realized this wasn't just about delaying the inevitable. It was something more. Chapter 23. The real reason Claire didn't want out of the marriage. At least not for the reasons I thought. She had signed everything, all but finalizing the divorce. But in her counterclaim, she made a stunning confession. She didn't want to leave because of Daniel. She was pregnant. The words hit me like a freight train, the paper slipping from my hand. I sat in the car for what felt like hours. Claire, pregnant. By him. The man I'd caught in our bed, the one who had been a shadow in my life for months. How could I have been so blind? I didn't call her, didn't text her, not yet. Instead, I went to the bar, ordered a drink, and tried to process the mess I was in. Chapter 24. Confrontation again. The next day, Claire came to my house, standing in the doorway like a ghost. She didn't even knock. She just walked in. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said quietly, her eyes downcast. "I was going to after the divorce was finalized, but you found out first." Pregnant. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. She nodded. "It's his. I didn't plan this. It wasn't part of the affair." Her voice cracked, but I could hardly feel sorry for her. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded. "Why not before everything got out of hand?" "I didn't want you to stay out of guilt," she said. "I didn't want to drag you back into a marriage that had already fallen apart, and now, with everything, I don't know what to do. I don't know what I'm doing anymore." She was shaking, but I couldn't tell if it was because of regret or the realization that she had crossed a line too far to return from. I leaned against the door frame, silent, watching her unravel in front of me. The woman I thought I knew, who was now a stranger carrying the child of another man. "I don't know what to say to you," I finally muttered. "I should be angry, and I am, but I'm also just exhausted." Her eyes met mine, her voice a whisper. "I never meant to hurt you like this." But I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Chapter 25. The decision days passed as the reality of the situation set in. I went through the motions, but each moment felt heavier than the last. My mind kept spinning, trying to understand how it had all happened, how someone you trust, someone you love, could tear everything apart so easily. Claire's lawyer pushed for reconciliation. They offered mediation, therapy. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't walk back into a life I had already burned down. I had to move on. Chapter 26. The Unseen Choice. A month later, I sat in a new office, in front of a fresh set of legal papers. This time, they weren't about divorce. They were about custody. Claire's pregnancy had changed everything. And though we were still technically separated, I knew I had to prepare for what would come next. The truth was, I had no idea what the future held. But one thing was clear. I was done looking backward. I'd already lost Claire. But I wasn't about to lose myself, too. And as I signed my name on the dotted line, I realized that sometimes the hardest part isn't moving forward. It's deciding to leave everything behind. Do you want to see how the custody battle plays out, or explore more of Claire's journey and whether she and Daniel stay together? Or perhaps a twist on what comes next for you? Let me know how you'd like it to evolve beneath the surface. Part 8, Chapter 27. The custody war. The papers were signed. The battle lines drawn. As much as I hated the thought of being tied to Claire, I couldn't ignore the reality. There was a child coming. My child. Despite everything, That had happened. Despite the betrayal and the heartache, I couldn't simply walk away from that. But Claire didn't make it easy. She fought for full custody, of course. She had to. She was the mother, after all, and her lawyers made it clear she intended to keep the child in her home, her new home, the one she shared with Daniel now. I couldn't help but feel the sting of that. He was already part of her new life. And whether I liked it or not, he was going to be part of the child's life, too. I didn't want to fight her. I didn't want to make things worse for a baby who hadn't even been born yet. But I wasn't going to give up without a fight. We had our first court date 2 weeks later. Chapter 28. The Courtroom. The courtroom felt cold and sterile, and for the first time I realized I wasn't just fighting Claire. I was fighting everything she had now. Daniel, her new life, their future. I stood in front of my lawyer, feeling the weight of my decision. Claire sat on the other side of the room, her face drawn tight with stress. Daniel wasn't there. He had an alibi for the day, and I wasn't sure whether that was a good or bad thing. When the judge entered, everything fell silent. She asked us to speak, and Claire went first. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "I'm the mother," she said, "and I want to provide stability for my child. After everything, I know I'm the best option for raising this child. My partner, Daniel, and I are financially stable, and I can offer a safe, loving home." Her words were smooth, confident, but I knew the cracks. I knew the lies she told herself. Then it was my turn. I stood up slowly, watching the judge as I took a breath. The words felt heavy in my mouth, but I pushed through. I'm not asking for full custody. I know my child needs both parents, but I want to be involved in their life. I want to be a part of their future. I felt Claire's eyes on me, cold and distant. But I didn't let her gaze affect me. This was for me, for the child. The judge nodded, writing something down on her notepad. "We'll reconvene in 2 weeks for a follow-up hearing. I expect both parties to present their case with full transparency." When it was over, I didn't stay to face Claire. I couldn't. I had already given her enough of my life. Chapter 29. A twist in the tale as I walked out of the courthouse, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" I answered, expecting the usual calls from my lawyer or random inquiries. Instead, a deep voice spoke. "This is Daniel Kessler." I froze for a moment. My heart skipped, and then the anger started to bubble. "What do you want?" I demanded. "To talk," he said calmly. "I know you're pissed off, and you have every right to be, but I'm not the villain here. Claire made her choices, and I was just part of it." I laughed bitterly. "A part of it? You were the part." "Maybe," he said, "but I never wanted any of this to happen. And I know she's your wife. But she's pregnant. With my child, too. We're both trying to do the right thing here." "Right thing?" I scoffed. "You're asking me to just forget that you've been lying and sleeping with my wife? You think that's the right thing?" Daniel didn't flinch. "No. I'm just saying that we all need to figure out how to handle this like adults. The last thing this kid needs is a bitter war between us." I didn't answer at first. His words hit harder than I expected. He was right, in a twisted way. Finally, I spoke. "I don't care about you, Daniel, but I'll fight for my kid. I'll fight for them, no matter who's involved." "Then let's figure out how to coexist," Daniel said. "For the baby. If you want to fight this like a war, it's going to destroy all of us." I ended the call before he could say more, but as I stared at the screen, I realized something that made my stomach churn. He wasn't wrong. Chapter 30. The Reckoning. 2 weeks later, we met again. This time, Claire wasn't alone. Daniel sat beside her, calm and collected. He looked at me with no malice, just the quiet understanding of a man who had no intention of backing down. The judge started the proceedings. But as the hours dragged on, I realized that the court couldn't decide this for us. This was about more than just paperwork. This was about the choices we had made and the lives we were about to change forever. I looked at Claire, really looked at her, and saw not the woman I had married, but the woman she had become. I didn't recognize her, and I wasn't sure I wanted to anymore. But for the sake of the baby, I knew I had to find a way to let go of the past, to stop fighting for something that was already gone. And as the hearing adjourned, I felt a shift inside me. Maybe there was no winning here, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to move forward. Beneath the Surface, Part 9, Chapter 31. A New Beginning. The courtroom door closed behind us with a resounding finality, and for the first time in weeks, the weight on my shoulders lightened, just a fraction. We didn't resolve anything today, but something had shifted. Claire was still standing beside Daniel, her hand resting on his arm, the image of a family that wasn't mine anymore. The realization hit me like a quiet storm. It was done. I knew I had to let go. The mediator suggested a temporary shared custody arrangement, something that could allow both of us to ease into this new reality without dragging the process out. Claire agreed. Daniel remained silent, but his presence was enough to remind me of the life they were now building. I walked out of that courthouse with a sense of relief, but also a profound emptiness. Claire was gone, and the only thing left was this fragile, tentative connection to the child we'd made. Chapter 32. The change, it wasn't easy. In the weeks that followed, Claire and I barely spoke, only in short clinical exchanges about the child's well-being, about visitation schedules and appointments. We became strangers who shared a common goal, the baby. At first it felt like a strange limbo. We didn't know how to act around each other, how to communicate beyond the basics. But something unexpected began to happen. As Claire's pregnancy progressed, I found myself growing more protective. I started attending doctor's appointments, something I hadn't done when we were together. And for the first time, I saw her not just as my ex-wife, but as a woman, one carrying a life I had a part in creating. I started to feel something again. I was terrified. But I couldn't walk away from this. I couldn't abandon my child. There was a moment during one of those doctor's visits when Claire looked at me in a way I hadn't seen in months. Her eyes were tired, vulnerable. "You're here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have to be," I replied. "It's my responsibility, Claire. It's our child." And for the first time in months, there was a quiet understanding between us. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but a shared responsibility. It was the beginning of something different. Chapter 33. The day Claire went into labor, everything changed. I received a text in the middle of the night. "It's happening. I need you here." I didn't hesitate. When I arrived at the hospital, Claire was already in the delivery room. The whole world felt surreal. This woman who had betrayed me, this woman who had torn apart everything we had, was now giving birth to our child. My child. I stood at the door, unsure of what to do. My hands were cold, my throat was tight. But as I stepped inside, Claire looked at me with the faintest smile. "I don't know if I can do this alone," she whispered. I didn't have the answers, but I knew I couldn't turn my back on her. Not now. Not when the most important part of our lives was about to begin. I stepped forward. "You're not alone," I said. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like I was doing something right. The hours stretched on. There was pain. There was fear. There were moments when we both thought it wouldn't end. But when the baby finally arrived, a boy, we both breathed a collective sigh of relief. I held him for the first time, feeling his tiny, fragile body in my arms. His eyes were closed, his face scrunched in a way that made my heart swell. This was the new beginning. For all the pain, the betrayal, the loss, I had something new to fight for now. And this time, it wasn't about Claire. It was about my son. Chapter 34. The Future. The weeks following the birth were a blur of sleepless nights and adjustments. Claire and I were still adjusting to being co-parents, still finding our footing. There were moments of awkward silence, moments when the distance between us felt like a canyon. But there were also small victories. The first time I got up in the middle of the night to soothe the baby. The first time Claire smiled at me without the weight of our past hanging over her. We weren't a family again, not by a long shot, but we were parents, and that was something. As the months passed, I spent more time with my son. I began to understand what it meant to truly care for someone, to be responsible for their well-being, and in doing so, I began to heal. I realized I didn't need to hold on to the anger anymore. I didn't need to keep fighting a war that had already been lost. And maybe in the end, Claire and I weren't meant to stay together. But we were both meant to be parents. And that was enough. Would you like to explore the evolution of their co-parenting dynamic, or perhaps a new chapter focusing on the challenges of raising the child with Claire and Daniel in the picture? Or do you want a twist on how the story unfolds further? Beneath the Surface, Part 10, Chapter 35. Co-parenting time passed and the child, our child, grew. His name was Ethan, a small, innocent thing that carried within him the potential for both joy and heartbreak. The first year of co-parenting was difficult, to say the least. Claire and I had found some semblance of peace, but it was fragile. Our relationship, strained by betrayal and broken trust, couldn't heal overnight. Still, we both tried. For Ethan, for the sake of the new life we'd brought into this world, there were shared moments, awkward exchanges where we had to pretend, if only for a few minutes, that everything between us was okay. Birthdays, holidays, school events, all the usual milestones parents go through. And each time we met, Claire's presence, though familiar, still felt distant. Daniel's presence. At these gatherings added another layer of complexity I wasn't prepared for. His calm demeanor, his ability to interact with Ethan like a natural father, left me with a constant reminder of the life they'd forged together. I struggled with it. There were times when I would hold Ethan in my arms, feeling the weight of him, and wonder if things could have turned out differently. Could Claire and I have worked things out? Could I have forgiven her sooner? But I also realized that the child in my arms wasn't a reminder of what I had lost. He was the future. And with each passing day, I couldn't help but fall deeper into the role of father. The love I had for him was pure, untouchable. That was the one thing I could count on, my commitment to Ethan. Chapter 36. Moments of understanding. One evening, Claire and I found ourselves alone in the living room after putting Ethan to bed. It wasn't the first time we had been in the same room without the tension of our past hanging between us. But it felt different now. The quiet hum of the house, the fading glow from the lamp overhead, made everything feel oddly serene. We were still adjusting, still figuring out how to be in each other's lives without the bitterness of the past. "I never thought we'd get here," Claire said quietly, her eyes on the empty space between us. "After everything, I didn't think we'd be able to be in the same room." I stared at her for a moment, thinking about the years we spent together, the love we once had, and the devastation that followed. But there was something softer in her eyes now, something that made me hesitate. I didn't either, I said, my voice low. But Ethan needs us both, and that's all that matters now. Claire looked at me, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. You're a good dad, she said, and there was a sincerity in her tone that caught me off guard. I'm trying, I replied. I wasn't sure I could after everything, but I'm trying. There was a moment of silence, an unspoken understanding hanging between us. The weight of the past, of betrayal, of shattered trust, was still there, but it was buried under the responsibility we both felt for Ethan. Do you think we'll ever be able to be friends again? Claire asked, almost hesitant. I met her gaze. I don't know, I admitted. But maybe we don't need to be. We just need to do this right for him. For Ethan. She nodded, the lines of stress around her eyes softening just a little. I think that's enough. And for the first time in a long while, I believed her. Chapter 37. Ethan's Future. As Ethan grew, so did the bond between us, Claire, Daniel, and me in our own way. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, moments when our paths crossed in uncomfortable ways. But through it all, Ethan was the constant. I spent more time with him, watching as he learned how to walk, speak, and explore the world with innocent wonder. I was there for his first steps, his first words, and countless moments that filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't known before. And slowly, very slowly, Claire and I found ourselves developing a quiet respect for each other. It wasn't about rekindling anything romantic. That ship had sailed long ago. But we both realized that in this strange, broken family we'd created, there was still love. Different, complicated love, but love nonetheless. Daniel, too, was part of the equation. I could no longer ignore his role in Ethan's life, and as much as I resented him at first, I came to appreciate that he genuinely cared for Ethan. He was a good man, and in some twisted way, I felt a sense of gratitude for him being there. We were all part of Ethan's story now, each of us writing our own chapter. And somehow, we were learning to coexist, even if only for his sake. Chapter 38. The unseen future one day, as I watched Ethan play with a toy car on the living room floor, I realized that everything had changed. For the first time since all of this began, I wasn't looking backward. I wasn't holding on to the past or trying to fight what had happened. I was here. I was present. I was a father. And in this new life, I had to embrace that. Beneath the Surface. Part 11. Chapter 39. The passing year's time has a way of making everything seem distant, even the most painful memories. As the years passed, Ethan grew from a small, curious infant into an inquisitive, energetic boy. He was the center of both Claire's and my worlds, and though our co-parenting arrangement remained strained at times, there was an unspoken understanding between us. Ethan was our priority. He had begun asking more questions lately. Questions about why his parents didn't live together, about why his father sometimes looked so sad when they spoke of the past. These were the questions I had hoped wouldn't come, at least not so soon. But they were inevitable. Claire and I tried to answer him honestly, in age-appropriate terms, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. How could I explain to him the complexity of the world we had made for him? The world that had once been just two parents, in love, and now had shifted into something foreign, fractured. I wasn't sure how to answer, but every time Ethan looked at me with those big, searching eyes, I promised myself I would always be there. That was the one thing I could give him, no matter what. Chapter 40. The return of the past. It had been a long time since I had seen Daniel, and though we shared joint custody of Ethan, our interactions were limited to necessary exchanges. But one day I received an unexpected message from him. "Can we meet? It's about Ethan." I hesitated, unsure of what this was about. It had been years since we last had a conversation outside of the usual exchanges about school schedules or doctors' appointments, but there was something in his message that made me curious. We agreed to meet at a local cafe, away from the tension of our homes. Daniel looked older, more serious than I remembered, but there was something familiar in his demeanor. A quiet confidence, the same way he had carried himself when we first met. "Thanks for meeting with me," he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. "What's this about?" I asked, not bothering with small talk. Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's about Ethan. He's getting older, and I've been thinking about the future." I waited. "Claire and I have been talking," he continued, his gaze steady. "And we're considering moving. It's a great opportunity, but it would change things. Our schedules, where Ethan would live. We wanted to talk to you before making any decisions." My stomach tightened. "Where would you move to?" "Somewhere far away," Daniel said, his voice calm but his eyes searching mine for any sign of reaction. "It's not set in stone, but it's something we've been looking into, and I wanted to know what you think." I felt a surge of anger at the idea. The thought of Ethan being taken away from me, of him living in a different state, a different environment, it hit me like a blow to the chest. "I'm not okay with that," I said, my voice firm. "Ethan needs to have both of us in his life. If you move, what happens to that?" Daniel sighed. "I understand your concerns, but it's not just about us. It's about Ethan's future. We've made a life together, and we think it's in his best interest." "But what about my role in his life?" I shot back, my fists tightening. "I'm not just some visitor. I'm his father, Daniel, and I'll fight to stay in his life." Daniel's expression softened, but he didn't back down. "I'm not asking you to give up your role as his father, but you have to understand, Ethan's life is going to change, and you need to be a part of that decision." There was a long silence. The weight of the conversation sat heavy between us. I thought about Ethan. His laughter, his curious mind, the way he had already started to show traits from both Claire and me. I couldn't imagine not seeing him every day, not being part of his life in the way I had promised. "I won't let him go without a fight," I said finally, my voice steady but filled with determination. "If you move, we'll need to figure out a way for me to stay involved. I won't lose him." Daniel nodded. I expected nothing less. The conversation ended there, but the unease lingered. The reality of what lay ahead hit me with a sharp, undeniable force. Chapter 41. Shifting dynamics in the weeks that followed, Claire and Daniel made their plans, while I did everything I could to ensure that I would remain a significant part of Ethan's life. I hired a lawyer, prepared to fight for joint custody in the event of the move, and began researching every legal avenue available to me. It wasn't about controlling Ethan's life. It was about making sure he knew that I was here, that I was, always going to be here. And in the middle of this legal battle, I found myself confronting a truth I hadn't wanted to admit. I wasn't just fighting for my son. I was fighting for myself, for the chance to be the father I never thought I could be, for the right to be part of his world. Beneath the Surface, Part 12. Chapter 43. Legal Crossroads. The days after that conversation with Claire were filled with a new kind of tension. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore, it was about everything I had built in my life, and the threat of it slipping away. The thought of losing him, of him growing up with a new family that wasn't mine, gnawed at me constantly. I began attending lawyer meetings more frequently, digging into every possible legal angle. I wasn't about to lose the most important thing in my life without a fight. The custody battle was as grueling as I had feared. Each exchange between my lawyer and Claire's felt like a tug of war, each one pulling us further apart. Every conversation was marked by the cold reality that no matter what happened, nothing would ever be the same again. Claire and Daniel were determined to make the move happen. The promise of a new life, a fresh start, was tempting. But they had underestimated the depth of my resolve. When the judge called us into the courtroom, I stood there with a clarity I hadn't known I could feel. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about ensuring that Ethan's future included me, no matter the distance. Claire sat across from me, her eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. She looked older now, more tired, like the weight of the decisions she was making was finally catching up with her. Daniel sat beside her, his presence as solid and unyielding as ever. But I didn't care about him. This was about Ethan. The legal process was slow. It was painful. Every question, every back and forth felt like a blow, a reminder of how fractured everything had become. But I couldn't back down. Chapter 44. The Testimony. When my turn came to speak, I felt the weight of the room pressing in on me. The judge, the lawyers, Claire and Daniel, they were all watching, waiting for my response. I stood tall, despite the unease I felt. "I love my son," I began, my voice steady. "And no matter where he lives, I will always be there for him. I'll support him, I'll guide him, and I'll love him. But I won't let anyone take him away from me without a fight." I paused, the words hanging in the air, and I looked at Claire. "I know we've been through a lot, Claire," I continued, my voice softer, though no less resolute. "But I'm his father, and I deserve to be part of his life. Just like you and Daniel. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he knows that." There was a silence, and for a moment, I thought I might have said too much. But then I saw a flicker in Claire's eyes, something close to understanding, something raw and real. She didn't respond immediately. Neither did Daniel, but the words had been said. Chapter 45. The Decision. The judge's decision came 2 weeks later. The courtroom was tense when we gathered for the final ruling. Claire sat rigid, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze never leaving the judge. Daniel sat beside her, stoic as ever. I sat quietly, my heart pounding. This wasn't just a legal matter. This was my future with Ethan. The judge cleared his throat, then addressed us. "After considering the circumstances, I've come to a decision. Ethan will remain in the current shared custody arrangement. There will be adjustments to visitation schedules, but neither party will have to relocate. Both parents will be expected to cooperate in facilitating Ethan's relationship with the other parent." There it was, a victory, but a bittersweet one. The legal battle was over, but the emotional fallout lingered. I had won the right to remain in Ethan's life, but I knew this wasn't the end of the road. The truth was, no matter how much we tried to carve out a new normal, nothing would ever be the same. Claire and Daniel would still be part of Ethan's life, and I would always be his father. But the lines between us would remain drawn. The weeks following the ruling were quieter, but the tension was still there. Claire and I learned to navigate this new phase of co-parenting. We still didn't speak much, except when it was necessary for Ethan's sake. The awkwardness between us persisted, but there was also a mutual respect that had grown from the decision. Chapter 46. Growing pains, as Ethan grew, so did the complexities of our relationship. There were still moments when I caught myself watching him with Claire and Daniel, wondering if I was doing enough, if I was truly giving him what he needed. He was a bright, curious child who had learned to love both of his families in his own way. But with each new milestone, I found myself facing a painful truth. He was growing up in a world that wasn't mine alone. One evening, after Ethan had finished a school project that I had helped him with, he turned to me with wide, innocent eyes. "Dad, do you think I'll ever live with you again?" he asked. The question took me by surprise. I had never expected him to ask, at least not so soon. I don't know, buddy, I replied, ruffling his hair.